This is Outside Shots, the college hoops podcast for betting underdogs on a nightly basis, fading Wisconsin basketball at all costs, including Greg Gard, and of course discussing everything else you need to know on the odds board presented by TheLines.com. My name is Eli Herskovich. You can follow me on Twitter at Eli Herskovich. My co-host name is Scott Phillips, who I'll introduce, and he'll introduce himself in a second. You can follow Scott on Twitter at Phillips Hoops. If you're listening to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. And you'll also have a chance to win an Amazon gift card. We're giving away 4 of those. So make sure to subscribe, rate, and review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notifications for whenever a new episode of Outside Shots is released. Here's what's going to be coming up on our podcast schedule for Outside Shots during the college basketball season. In non-conference play, we'll have a new episode up every Monday morning or Monday afternoon, I guess, depending on when Scott and I decide to record, with the exception of next week. We're going to have our traditional Monday episode out on Tuesday. Live shows before big games in Discord. Go to TheLines.com and subscribe to our Discord channel. Get immediate notifications on all of our best bets and futures bets, single game bets, everything you could find for not just college basketball, but every single sport. And then you'll be able to watch our live pregame shows for betting content. And also my standard write-ups over at TheLines.com, previewing the biggest games of the day and my best bets. Scott will have some write-ups too over at TheLines.com. And then coming up in conference play, once the big games get rolling among the Power 5 schools and the rest of college basketball, we'll have our traditional Monday episode, a Thursday episode to preview the Saturday games, and a live show on Saturday morning. So a lot to get to this college basketball season. This is my first college basketball podcast in a year plus. I've been waiting to get back at it, and I couldn't have a better co-host alongside me. Again, Scott Phillips. You can follow him on Twitter at Phillips Hoops. He covered basketball, college basketball, for a decade plus for NBC, and now he's joining me with not only his college basketball experience, but a lot of betting experience mixed in as well. So, Scott, really looking forward to having you on along for the ride here on Outside Shots.
It's going to be a great season, Eli. I mean, I'm really itching to go in terms of this season kicking off. Obviously, the first week slate, as we will get to later in the show, a little bit of a dud. But, man, you look at Feast Week and some of the stuff we've got rolling in the pipeline for Thanksgiving. And, man, there's some really good tournaments coming up. It's kind of a wide open season, as we've discussed off the podcast. There's not really a clear juggernaut like a Gonzaga Baylor situation a few years ago. And, man, this is just going to be a really fun season and a fun setup with this podcast.
And Scott, I know you tend to be a little bit modest, but you probably, in terms of when I was thinking about people that I wanted to co-host with me on this podcast, your basketball IQ, coaches like to use that as a cliche a lot, but you have a very high-level basketball IQ, and again, your betting experience as well, a winning gambler. So really pumped to have you on board here. Just in terms of your basketball knowledge, it's going to bring a lot to our audience that's going to continue to grow as the season moves along.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun getting back in the swing of things. I've taken a little bit of a break from college hoops the last few years and really focused most of my betting efforts on golf, and been pretty successful picking some futures for some majors and week in and week out with things like that. But, you know, I've been working in college basketball for about 14 years now, mostly on the elite recruiting level side of things, 7 years at NBC Sports with College Basketball Talk with the great Rob Doster and a lot of talented people in the mix there as well. And I also did 7 years of high school coverage for NBC Sports Chicago, doing television for a lot of the local high school games and trying to put some of those players in the spotlight before they went on to college in the NBA. So just really excited to be here. There's a great season that we have coming up ahead, and, you know, just really a lot of things to get to in this show.
Yeah. So be sure to follow TheLines.com on Twitter at TheLinesUS to get even more updates on our schedule over at Outside Shots. And again, follow myself on Twitter at Eli Herskovich and Scott on Twitter at Phillips Hoops. So Scott, you mentioned that in your spiel that there isn't a true juggernaut in college basketball this season. And we kind of saw that going back to last year with Kansas's run to win in the national championship. They opened the season at around plus 1,400, so 14-1 odds. I believe those odds are coming from BetMGM, and around 20-1 the previous April. So we saw a little bit of a dip in the value in terms of their number to begin the season. And then you think about the run that they went on again during the 2022 NCAA tournament. They beat Texas Southern, 16 seed. They beat Creighton without Ryan Nembhard. We're going to talk about the Blue Jays a lot on this podcast. They beat the Providence Friars, who I faded a lot and lost a lot of money on going back to Big East play last year. But I did come back and cashed with Providence against Kansas. I believe they were 6 or 7 point underdogs in the Sweet 16. Then they played Miami of Florida. Yeah, exactly. And then they played Miami of Florida in the Elite Eight. Again, a team that was fortunate in their own right to get to that point. They beat Villanova with a hell of a shooting performance from beyond the three-point arc with Ochai Agbaji, and couple that with Villanova not having Justin Moore in that game. And then a North Carolina team that had its own fair share of breaks to get to the national title game. They blitz in the second half with their transition offense and end up winning the title. Didn't cover, thankfully, because I had UNC plus 3.5, plus 4. But Kansas wins the national title. So, again, looking back at previous seasons, Scott, then you look at that Kansas team, and we'll get to the odds board here in a second, but their run was flawed. And similarly, with the odds board that we have at the top, North Carolina, Gonzaga, Houston, Kentucky, those are the 4 teams. Odds are, depending on the sports book, you have one favorite here, another favorite there, but none of those teams are juggernauts in terms of the top 4 favorites to win the national championship.
No, certainly not, Eli. I think the consensus favorite is probably North Carolina by virtue of obviously being in that game with Kansas last year and making a little bit of a surprise run and finally kind of living up to those top 15 preseason expectations. They return 4 starters. They replace Brady Manick with Pete Nance. But, this is still a pretty flawed team with a second-year coach that's still really trying to figure out what they were and what really happened during the regular season last year before they went on that run. So, the talent levels there. We'll get into that with Carolina, but again, all these teams really have a lot of flaws. There's a lot of things that they lost from the previous year. You have Gonzaga with their rim protection issues with Chet being gone. You have Baylor returning guys from injuries and maybe not having a true point guard in play in terms of their high ball screen offense. And, Houston's obviously returning some guys from injury as well that need to mesh. And, they defied expectations last year without some key guys being out. So, it's pretty wide open. There's a lot of second-tier teams we've discussed off pod that we really like. And, there's obviously the juggernauts at play, but no clear favorite by any means.
Yeah, so and good stuff there, Scott. Let's dig into North Carolina a little bit more in terms of their roster construction for this year. So you bring back the ACC preseason player of the year in Armando Bacot, Caleb Love, RJ Davis, Leaky Black, all back. And you mentioned Pete Nance, who they got from Northwestern. Not really sure how Chris Collins still has a job with the Wildcats, but I digress about the worst team potentially in the Big Ten this season. But you lose Brady Manick, and I want to start there because if you go back, and there are a couple other things that made this North Carolina run to the national championship a bit flawed. But if you go back to the Duke game in particular and other games during their run in the latter part of conference play, even when they beat Duke at Cameron Indoor in Coach K's final game there, and then you beat Duke in the Final Four in Coach K's final game ever as a college basketball head coach. Manick's contested shot making, though, was unparalleled. There was no comparison to his ability to hit contested shots, and he was a okay rim protector in his own right. So yes, you're bringing in Pete Nance, who could space the floor, but Brady Manick's shot making, I think, is going to be missed on this team a lot. And then the other note that when I dig into their Final Four run last year, this was a pretty poor transition defense overall. And we saw that in particular against Kansas in the national title game in that second half when the Jayhawks made their big run and overcame a double-digit halftime deficit. But they also got pretty fortunate in terms of opponents' three-point shooting during that stretch in March, or in mid to late March and early April. Opponents shot 28.3% from three And this is a team that ranked in the bottom half of college basketball in terms of open three-point percentage allowed. So they allowed their fair share of open three-point looks. And when you have Armando Bacot on the floor and teams can space the floor, you're naturally going to give up more open looks. And they got fortunate in the teams that they played in the tournament that didn't necessarily shoot all that well, or at least all the way up to their potential.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit it on the head, Eli. I really think that they had some advantageous matchups there in the tournament. They took advantage of full force, and again, the key for me is Nance over Manek, and that's all that everybody's been discussing. We know what we're getting out of the core four returning starters. You could argue that R.J. Davis and Caleb Love are the best returning backcourt in college basketball. You know that Leaky Black is going to be the ultimate glue guy, defender, kind of fifth starter who doesn't really need his fair share of shots or touches to be somebody that really benefits them. And I don't think there was a more productive player in the NCAA tournament than Armando Bacot. I mean, the double-double machines, the way that he was able to just clear the glass and get them moving on the offensive end. I mean, that's something that you can't take for granted. But, Brady Manek was going through wars in the Big 12 when he played with Oklahoma. He had a lot of success even as a freshman playing with Trae Young. Pete Nance hasn't necessarily played on the big stage all that often at Northwestern. He's been productive. He's improved year over year. You could argue that his ceiling and his upside and his talent is better than Brady Manek, but does he have that dog in him, as they like to say, to really, bang down low like Manek would by the end of the season? Can he hit those big shots that Brady Manek hit in the NCAA tournament? The numbers suggest that he can. He is a little bit of a rim protector. He did shoot 45% from three-point range last season, but again, this is someone who really hasn't been battle tested the way that these other guys have been on this roster and what Brady Manek did before going through the Big 12. And I really want to see what it's going to be like when that pressure situation hits and where Pete Nance looks from there.
No, it's a great point. I can't believe you mentioned Trae Young. I mean, that was what, 2017, I want to say, when they lost to Rhode Island in the first round of the NCAA tournament.
It's a long time ago, and it speaks to the experience level that Manek brought to the table. I mean, he was their second gun on that team, and again, he's somebody who wasn't afraid to take and hit the big shot, and that's going to be something that they need to find in terms of whether that's Caleb Love taking over or RJ Davis, and who's going to take and make some of those big shots that Manek took last year.
I will say, if you watch in the national title game in particular, Puff Johnson could be a guy to watch off the bench.
Absolutely. I really like his upside this year in terms of getting better. And, in terms of a sixth man, one of the better guys in the ACC.
Can shoot it, too. So you bring in a guy like that can develop. There's a lot of potential there as a depth piece for North Carolina. But similar to what we were talking about with Kansas last year, and granted, Kansas got pretty fortunate in the title game when Bacot, I believe it was his ankle, kicked off the floorboard and it got re-injured. And then you flip on the other end of the floor. Granted, Kansas, I don't know why they didn't push the floor to score on that possession. They ended up calling timeout and going back to the half court, but McCormick takes advantage against the aforementioned Brady Manek in the post. So a lot of things to like about this North Carolina team. You mentioned arguably the best backcourt in college basketball, most dominant big in the country in theory, and again, arguably, but there are some flaws in terms of that run last year that make you question, should North Carolina be the favorite? But then again, a lot of these other teams in terms of the top four, the four shortest odds to win the national championship, have their fair share of flaws too. And let's go on to Gonzaga, Scott, plus 900 around that price, and tied with North Carolina at some of the sports books. If you go to TheLines.com, you could price shop. And if you want to bet Gonzaga futures, you could do just that over at TheLines.com. Sign up for some great sportsbook offers in the process. So the Zags bring back Drew Timme, who probably because of NIL, I don't think he stays. Granted, I don't know how good of an NBA player he is going to be. He really is the prototypical elite college basketball player, kind of similar to Tyler Hansbrough. I don't know how dominant he'll be in the NBA, but we'll see. And transitioning back here. So Mark Few's offense runs through the low post. And I honestly thought that having Holmgren and Timme on the floor last year limited Timme's touches, which
that's a fair statement.
Yeah, which held Gonzaga back a little bit offensively, still an elite offense, but then you watch their games in the tournament and they weren't an elite offense. They needed that second half run where Timme dominated to start the second half against Memphis. And then offensively, they didn't shoot well against Arkansas, and you could chalk that up to variance. But one point that you hit on with the Zags earlier on with Chet Holmgren, an elite rim protector, and his ability to switch on and off ball. So you're losing your best defensive player for a defense that needs that and is probably going to take a step back, like we saw against Tennessee in that scrimmage. Granted, it's a scrimmage, but they didn't look great defensively.
No, and again, I think one of the understated things about Chet Holmgren is not only the defensive acumen, but turning defense into offense. I mean, he could take a blocked shot or clear a rebound, and he can push the ball himself and get other guys set up. And it was such a unique thing to watch, and a unique thing that Gonzaga had with their lineup that nobody else in the country had. And, you take that away, it's going to be a more traditional team now. I think they go through Timmy pretty much every possession, but it's just one of those things where they have the talent again. You look at the blue chippers on this roster, the guys like Malachi Smith that they were able to bring in to bolster their backcourt. I mean, the talent level top to bottom is there. They should roll through the WCC. This is seven consecutive years they've made the second weekend at the very least. They've ended twice now in that span on the last night of the season, losing in the title game. And there's going to be skeptics, and justifiably so. They haven't beaten a lot of elite level teams in the NCAA tournament during those 7 years of great runs to the second weekend and beyond. But I mean, you just look at guys like Drew Timme and Julian Strawther. I mean, the talent level's there. To me, I think the biggest question mark is obviously Nolan Hickman. Replacing Andrew Nembhard, who we haven't really mentioned yet, is going to be a really difficult thing to do. I mean, Nembhard, a little bit unsung in terms of what he brought to the table with Timmy and Holmgren obviously taking center stage there. But, Nolan Hickman had a 5-star pedigree coming out of high school. Didn't really showcase that as much last season because he didn't need to. But this is really his team now for all intents and purposes. And he needs to showcase that he can get Timmy the ball, that he can score and knock down shots on his own, that he could push the pace for this offense when needed. And again, I think this team goes as far as Nolan Hickman goes.
No, it's a good point. And granted, it changes up a little bit if you end up bringing Malachi Smith off the bench, in terms of maybe not having as much pressure on Hickman to start versus if you have
they've got
Smith
other
in the
options
starting
too.
lineup.
Yeah, receiver, receiver
Bolton
is there. But, again, when you look at the great Gonzaga teams of past, like they've got guys like Nigel Williams-Goss and Nembhard and, guys that were established, very, very good college point guards that, eventually turned into pro prospects. And Nolan Hickman has to prove himself in that regard. Obviously the pedigree was there coming out of high school, but a little bit shaky last year. And he was only 30% from 3-point range. That's got to obviously improve. And, again, how he sets up Timmy is going to be key for everything because Timmy's going to eat this year. He's going to maybe be National Player of the Year just by virtue of all of the touches he's able to get inside with Holmgren being gone. But it's just a fascinating team in terms of their top to bottom talent. And Mark Few is really, you don't want to say hacked the game because they've earned everything that they've accomplished, but, they've got that kind of top 4 seed on lock as long as they're able to get through the WCC unscathed and win a couple non-conference games. And, the loss to Tennessee, a little bit concerning in the charity matchup. Obviously, it's an exhibition, but to lose by 17 is a little bit of an eye raiser, but we'll see. I mean, I think that Hickman ultimately is going to have a solid season. This is once again a team that presents pretty solid value at where they're at in terms of at least getting to the second weekend and giving you a chance to have something in play. But I'm a little skittish in terms of taking them as a national title contender right now. Maybe they lose 1 or 2 early and that number drops. But, compared to some of these other teams, I'm not loving that value.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't bet plus 900, especially because there are some potential loopholes. Right, and there are some potential loopholes on that schedule to begin the season. Scott, we've talked about this off the podcast of where are some maybe buy low points for teams across the college basketball national title odds board, or when might they come? We saw that with Kentucky going back to last season when they struggled, highlighted by the loss to Notre Dame in non-conference play. And then their national title odds all of a sudden dip or raise, I guess, depending on how you look at it, from plus 1,800 to 30-1. That's when I bought on Kentucky and ended up losing to St. Peter's, so it didn't matter. But you can obviously get a better price later in the season with some of these teams. And you were mentioning with Gonzaga's offense, obviously so much upside. I think Julian Strother is going to take a massive step.
Yes.
He's your kind of prototypical 3-and-D in the NBA, but if you decides to put him at the 4 and space the floor around Timmy, which is what we've seen with some of these Gonzaga teams in the past, that makes them that much more lethal on offense. But then kind of what we've highlighted throughout this Gonzaga conversation on the flip side, your defense is going to take a step back against, or not just against, but without having that rim protector, without having a guy that could switch onto almost every position. As thin as Chet Holmgren was, and as much as he maybe didn't provide the ceiling that some thought he could in that sort of an offense, he was an elite defensive player, like you mentioned, sparking that transition attack. So we're both not as sold on Gonzaga, but I think that goes to say the same kind of opinion with some of these other teams at the top of the odds board, like we've harped on. So let's move on, Scott, to Houston, which is priced around plus 850, all the way up to plus 1100. Not a significant raise on the odds board, but nonetheless here around one of the favorites again to win the national championship, tie with Gonzaga as the favorite over at FanDuel Sportsbook. So you mentioned their guard play when we kind of went through these teams loosely at the beginning. And you're bringing back Marcus Sasser and Tremont Mark off their respective season-ending injuries last year. My issue with this team, and I think those guys are going to be fine health-wise. And also you bring in Jarence Walker, who's a lottery pick and is going to be an athletic, very much so, an athletic freak at both ends of the floor, is in terms of their defense and their ability to gang rebound, because you're losing 3 key players in that regard, and Moore, Fabian White, and Josh Carlton. Fabian White and Josh Carlton, 2 of the better offensive rebounders in the country, and Moore's ability to, when they trap and generate turnovers, and his length at the wing. So those are 3 key defensive players. And you think about where Houston was at both ends of the floor last year, top 15 in terms of shot quality, points per possession around the rim. So that means that they limited teams around the basket a ton in terms of opponent's efficiency, and they were very efficient in their own right because they generate so many second chance opportunities. I get the addition of Jarence Walker, but those are 3 key pieces that you're losing in those respective areas.
Yeah, their interior defense concerns me quite a bit. Obviously, this is a team built with a ton of dogs. You know, Kelvin Sampson's done an incredible job incorporating a culture that harps on defense. They get after you on all 5 positions. But, you know, Reggie Chaney at 6'8", he does an admirable job in the post. But, you know, the 2 teams we just talked about preceding Houston, what do they both have? They have dominant potential post scorers. And if you look at Houston's potential weakness in that regard, you sum it up right there. I mean, Reggie Chaney at some point is going to have to guard an elite level big in the NCAA tournament. And the major question is he able to handle that, or is the team able to swarm and contain and do things on their own? But that's my major question mark with this group right now.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Again, I think guard play will be fine for Houston.
Absolutely.
Sasser and Mark can both score it, but the biggest question is, can you protect the rim and can you generate those second chance opportunities that have made this Houston team so dominant under Calvin Sampson since he's gotten there? Granted, the AAC, and I know we're talking national title futures, the AAC isn't what it's been in terms of having a Memphis caliber team. I know they haven't necessarily lived up to those expectations under Penny Hardaway. But you don't have that second tier and third tier team. I think Temple can surprise a bit in this conference, especially with Battle back, and we'll get to Temple when we talk about some of these first week games. But Houston as a national title contender, similar to Gonzaga, similar to North Carolina, we both have our questions and our concerns about. On to Kentucky, Scott. A team that I mentioned I had that national title future with last season. They lose to St. Peter's, plus 900 to win it all this year, around that price tag for the shortest odds with North Carolina at Caesars, and all the way up to plus 1,200. Again, not a huge difference, but if you're looking for a bigger number on Kentucky, all the way up to plus 1,200. The reason why I think, Scott, we're both hesitant, keyword hesitant, with a bunch of these teams, including Kentucky now, as we're on to the Wildcats, is Oscar Tshiebwe's knee injury. The status of that is completely unknown. Severe Wheeler's knee injury. the status may be a little more positive, but it's still unknown in terms of his effectiveness and how long he's going to be out. So you have your reigning National Player of the Year in Oscar Tshiebwe, a top 2 rebounding rate at both ends of the floor last year. We have no idea when he's coming back and to what effectiveness. Your point guard, who, again, you have a recruit coming in, and a 5-star recruit in Carson Wallace, who can probably slide into that point guard role. But Wheeler also top 60 assist rate last year, one of the best distributors in the country. So there are 2 huge unknowns for a Kentucky team that, yes, has reloaded its shooting, with C.J. Frederick now healthy and Antonio Reeves from Illinois State after Kellen Grady and his plantar fasciitis cost them a lot down the stretch, especially against St. Peter's. 2 huge question marks, though, for the Wildcats.
Yeah, I mean, the injuries are very concerning. I think they eventually figure things out, and the front court depth is going to be just fine without Oscar. Obviously, he's the National Player of the Year and is the favorite to repeat this season, but their front court depth with how Jacob Toppin looked in the offseason is solid. Chris Livingston is another solid addition on the wing who plays a little bit bigger than 6'6", and Damian Collins and Lance Ware, I think, should take another leap as well. So they'll be able to withstand without Oscar for a little bit of time, but they really need him to be back and healthy and at his best if they're going to be the type of Final Four caliber team that people envision. And Cason Wallace is getting some Jamal Murray comparisons I saw with it's just interesting to see how he's going to fit in next to Wheeler, or if he's going to have to take over for Wheeler if he's out for any sort of significant time. I do think Reeves and Frederick offer a lot of floor spacing that they were maybe missing last season. Reeves is a bucket. I mean, he was getting 20 a game at Illinois State. I know that obviously the Valley not anywhere near the SEC, but he also doesn't need to be any sort of marquee scorer. And if you're drawing doubles and triples down in the post with Tshiebwe, then you're getting a lot of open looks for your guys on the perimeter. But for us right now, the number is really contingent on the health of 2 of their starters. And, there could be some dip in value early if they're losing some games, or, some momentum gets lost and Big Blue Nation gets a little bit testy. And you talk about that John Calipari hot seat, which, again, seems absurd to me that he would potentially be on the hot seat. But that's what Kentucky expects, is Final Fours every year, and they haven't been since 2015. So I get it. But again, I like this team quite a bit. I do think that if they are healthy, that you can book them as the SEC favorites for right now. But we got to monitor the health situation of Tshiebwe and Wheeler. I mean, it's definitely something that's a cause for concern right now.
And you look at the SEC conference odds: Kentucky plus 175, Tennessee plus 325. You mentioned you're high on the Vols, and a lot of good reason to be, and we'll get to Tennessee in a little bit. Arkansas plus 375. Florida 20-1. I'll touch on the Gators.
You love the Gators.
Teaser. I do love the Gators. I might love them a little too much. I don't know if I love the price as much as what I got it at, but 20-1 to win the conference. So we'll get to Florida a little later on when we talk about some long shots. But right, 2 injuries to monitor. You look at the beginning of Kentucky's schedule. Michigan State, they should handle without Oscar Tshiebwe. You mentioned the depth behind him in the front court. Gonzaga, though, even though John Calipari won't play the Zags at the Kennel, they're still going to play them at a quote-unquote neutral site, still on the West Coast, still in Washington, right? But he, unlike Texas last year, I'll give my boy Chris Beard some credit, played him and got blitzed at Gonzaga at their home court. And then UCLA, Michigan on Kentucky's schedule as well. 2 teams that I'm not super high on in terms of the way they're rated and presented in the market, especially with national title odds. But again, we'll touch on those teams and the rest of the odds board as we move along. But staying atop the odds board, Scott, one last team around the prices we've already mentioned, and probably a team that I think we're both higher on than the 4 others and a better price, is the Baylor Bears, or anywhere between plus 1,200 and plus 1,600 to win the national title. Bears are rated number 1 in my preseason top 25 power ratings. You can check that out over at TheLines.com. Now, I know you mentioned this when you were kind of flowing through things a little bit with some of the contenders, and I agree with you that the guard play in terms of how much they run their ball screen offense and operate it under Scott Drew is a little concerning. So you think about what they lost. You lose James Akinjo, and granted, he was a little shot happy at times, but it's still a loss.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Very, very much so. Matthew Meyer is off to Illinois. Jeremy Sohan and Kendall Brown, two of their 5 stars from last season, both gone. But you get a healthy LJ Cryer and Adam Flagler. Again, to what level those guys are in terms of what Drew wants to do offensively when the pressure is on both of them. I like Cryer a lot, but maybe you'll touch on that and we'll go back and forth. The big thing, though, is you add a 3-level scorer in Keontae Johnson that they didn't have. They haven't had that type of scoring option and scoring threat, at least last season. If you go back to 2 years ago winning the national championship, obviously you have a scorer like that pretty much at the 1 through 3 spot. But getting that piece in a 5-star freshman that could do just that, I think takes their offense to another level from what they had last year, as they were a little bit limited. If you go back to the North Carolina second round game before their defense ramped up, but before they ramped things up in transition and turned that North Carolina defense around and out of the half court where they're most comfortable. So I have my questions and concerns about the backcourt in terms of the ball screen offense. Potentially no Jonathan Talma-Tachera for the rest of for the entire season. That is still a Flo Thamba, but there are concerns. But among the 5 teams that we've mentioned, with Baylor being included, I'm probably most comfortable with the Bears, especially with that price.
That's interesting because for me, I've got those question marks in terms of Flagler and being a true point guard in a ball screen heavy offense. You know, Keontae George is going to make things a lot easier if you can get him the ball and make him a playmaker as people envision him to be. Langston Love is a little bit underrated in terms of his ability to maybe be a 6th man or somebody that can also come in right away. And, you know, that front court is going to be very solid. Jalen Bridges is obviously a battle-tested Big 12 player who should step in at the 4. Flo Thamba is about as solid as it gets down low. But, you know, between the issues with not having a true point guard in that ball screen offense and the lack of front court depth, if anything does happen with foul problems or injuries, you know, you touched on the season end or, you know, the knee issue of Jonathan. I can't even pronounce his name. I'm not even going to try with that. Talma-Tachera, sorry.
There you go.
You know, it's just one of those things where you're trusting Scott Drew. If you're taking this number right now, you're trusting what they've accomplished the last few seasons. They're going to defend. You know that they're going to get after you on that end of things. And again, I'm not trying to say that Flagler and Cryer are not great players. They are. They're all Big 12 potential players, excuse me, but it's the fit and the way that they run that ball screen offense that I'm a little bit concerned about. And I think they're placing a lot on Keontae George's shoulders right away.
No, it's a good point. And you mentioned the no middle defense. Baylor top 10 in terms of isolation scoring efficiency defensively last season. So that means they didn't allow opponents to get into their ISO sets. And when obviously that has to do with when you're trying to drive to the basket and you shut that down with the no middle defense. It seems like everybody copies each other in this conference. Everybody runs a no middle defense, probably from Mark Adams, going back to when he was an assistant under Chris Beard. Now everybody seemingly runs it in the Big 12.
Yeah, the Big 12 is a gauntlet.
Yeah, no, it's a crazy good conference, and differing opinions there on Baylor. I don't have a bet on Baylor, but among the 5 teams we've talked about, I think I'd be most comfortable backing the Baylor Bears, especially at that price at plus 1,600. But it's fair to question the guard play. I guess I'm a little higher on Cryer within this ball screen offense fit. And Flagler, again, I think produced at a pretty solid rate. Now, losing Akinjo and losing a little bit more scoring in the backcourt may hurt more than I anticipate, and maybe the collective group think about Baylor anticipates, but we'll continue on here around the college basketball odds board and sticking in the Big 12, Scott, with Kansas priced around plus 1,500, staying in this conference. You lose a lot. And when you think about what a national champion loses, it's probably around this, but I think the Jayhawks lost a little more when you think about the scoring efficiency between Ochai Agbaji, Christian Brown, Remy Martin, who came around and came along big time in the latter portion of a Big 12 play and in the tournament, hitting some huge threes for them in the national championship against North Carolina, and a depth piece in Mitch Lightfoot. And while McCormick was pretty inefficient overall throughout the season, in the tournament when they needed him, and especially in that North Carolina game, he was extremely efficient. So you lose those 5 guys, and then you bring in a high-level scorer and shooter in Grady Dick, a 5-star. You bring in Kevin McCullough from Texas Tech. Uday, the big that's probably going to be leaned on most to replace McCormick's production, and MJ Rice. So the big thing for me, going back to last year's Kansas team, Scott, was, and I mentioned this and harped on it with the national title game, Kansas super efficient in transition and most efficient in the half court when the ball was rolling through McCormick. Not as reliant on their post touches as a team like Gonzaga, but they still need a player like McCormick to be efficient. Now that pressure is on a 5-star freshman in Uday. So a lot of question marks for me with this Kansas offense in the half court. And then without a reliable shooter, or at least, again, what Ochai Agbaji brought to the table in terms of shooting efficiency. If you go back to the Texas Tech game at home in conference play, the Villanova game in the Final Four, you're losing a lot of established offensive pieces, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, there's major question marks here, Eli. Again, the front court not having that traditional Bill Self big man that we've come to see over the last, 8 to 12 years. I mean, you go from David McCormack, who is an aircraft carrier inside. You have Udoka, you have Thomas Robinson, you have all of these guys that they were able to flow through, and there's major question marks there now. And I think Jalen Wilson's going to be a massive key for this team. He's really got to upgrade and be kind of the top 40 recruit in his third season that this program envisioned him to be. And Jalen Wilson, to me, is fascinating because he could go small ball at the 5 at times, and without that true traditional post player, they've had Wilson at the 5 at times and had some effective lineups. And if they're switching everything, and Wilson's athleticism gives them a unique edge there, but there's going to be shooting question marks, and a lot of that's going to be put on Grady Dick very early as a true freshman, which is something to watch for. Again, I like this team. Bill Self always has you in the mix no matter what. He's one of the greatest coaches that college basketball has ever seen, but again, like, what are these lineups going to look like? What kind of growth are we going to see from Jalen Wilson? And will the perimeter shooting be consistent enough to not be able to flow through somebody on the interior as they usually do?
Right. And no, Wilson was supposed to be that last year, was supposed to take that big lead. Sure. Didn't for the most part. And then, right, now you need him to do just that this season. And he'll have the opportunity. McCullough as a ball handler, I think, is big, because he can attack you off the dribble. He can shoot it at a decent rate, too. Mm-hmm. So you have a reliable ball handler. DeJuan Harris, a guy we haven't really mentioned yet, sure, took some and made some strides, especially when Remy Martin was dealing with the injury more so throughout pretty much the back end of non-conference and then in conference play. So you need you need that stability at the point guard position, which I think McCullough also provides as a secondary ball handler. So Scott, we've hit on kind of the core 6, and I wanted to throw Kansas in there because the defending national champion, of course. Now we move on to some of these other teams near the top of the odds board. If you go over to TheLines.com, again, you could find the best price if you like any of the teams we're about to mention. UCLA around plus 1,600, Arkansas around plus 1,700, Texas anywhere from 20 to 30 to 1, Tennessee 25 to 1, and Creighton, which opened at 90 to 1, around now plus 2,500. Which of those 6 teams, I want to say 6 teams if I could do my math correctly, that are you most concerned about of that group?
I like Arkansas a lot, but not at that number. Let me add one more thing. Sure.
Hold on, I just want to, okay. Coming back down to 3, 2, and 1. Of the 6 teams, Scott, which team do you think is most overvalued in the market?
I think you have to be a little bit concerned about Arkansas. Obviously, Eric Musselman is kind of made himself a darling of the transfer portal and being able to clean out a roster and bring in new pieces season in and season out. But every single season you have to see what that recipe for success looks like. And, a ton of buzz around Nick Smith Jr., and deservedly so. He's probably the best pro prospect of any freshman in the country, but you're putting an awful lot on a freshman's shoulders right away, asking him to probably produce somewhere between 17 and 20 points per game. And, Eric Musselman is good as any coach in the country at exploiting mismatches, getting somebody like Smith the ball in advantageous situations and taking advantage of that over and over again. But, you have to share minutes and you have to get an entire group of guys that are basically new and coming together to buy into things. And at that number, that's a lot to ask. I mean, the numbers that we see Arkansas at, I'm looking anywhere from 15 to 20. I mean, those are similar numbers to some of the teams we were just talking about that return of a lot of experience and Final Four acumen. I mean, Arkansas is coming off of a ton of buzz. Obviously, the Elite Eight was there last season. Smith is as good as it gets. Anthony Black is a monster recruit. Yeah, back-to-back Elite Eights, you're right. But again, I want to see how these pieces fit at that number before I truly buy in.
No, I'm with you, because let's take a step back to last season. You lose Jalen Williams, who probably drew as many charges across college basketball, maybe in the last decade, man. I could not stand betting against Arkansas basketball and watching him take all these charges that probably shouldn't have been called. But nonetheless, you lose him. You lose J.D. Note, who was a shot maker down the stretch in games, probably their lead ball handler down the stretch. Audi's Tony, Trey Wade, Amude, and Chris Likes kind of what we touched on with some of these other guys that are back in college basketball. Probably a little too shot happy. I guess Akinjo was the comparison I was thinking of. Sure. Just a little too shot happy at times. So you lose 90% of your scoring. And you mentioned, you're bringing in these 5 stars in Smith and Black and Walsh and Brazil, who I like too, around the rim, and the Mitchell brothers from Rhode Island, formerly of Maryland. Graham,
I like
from
Ricky
Arizona.
Council a lot. Yeah, I mean, I like all these pieces. This is talent. You're naming name after name that's contributed, and not only that, but tons of guys that played a lot of minutes and averaged near double figures last year. But how's that all going to mesh? Yeah,
right. Exactly. How quickly can all of that come together for a national championship? And one other stat too that I was looking into: Arkansas relied on the free throw line and free throw scoring rate at such a high clip, the 31st highest free throw scoring rate across college basketball. When you think about guys that were elite at doing that, Jalen Williams and Note in particular. So you're not only relying, Scott, like you mentioned, on these freshman scores to adjust to the collegiate level and perform at a high level early on. That's kind of what you're betting into at that number. But you're losing a ton of scoring seemingly where they've gotten it in years past at the free throw line, which is concerning to me.
Definitely. Some of that will be mitigated. I mean, Ricky Council is a tremendous free throw shooter. So, you try to get him in spots where he's drawing fouls. Obviously, Nick Smith is going to draw a lot of fouls. This team will continue to get to the line. It's just how effective they are converting there and whether that's going to be a staple of their offense again. And, I really like this team. I do quite a bit, but not at that number. And I think that there is a chance that value doesn't really dip. They don't really have a great non-conference schedule. They shouldn't really be tested all that much. I mean, I'm looking at it now. They face Louisville. They face Oklahoma. Just kind of a blah non-conference schedule that doesn't really test them very much. But, that also gives them time to acclimate and to gel before the SEC season. And, again, I was hoping that number might dip. Maybe they get upset and that number does dip, and that's a time to maybe look at that value and reassess things. But at the current state of things where that number is, I'm not loving it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I don't like this Arkansas team. Even go back to last year, again, you need those kind of pieces, experienced pieces in Note and Williams to make that run, and you're missing that. Is we see this year over year, especially with a team like Duke, right, who we haven't really touched on that much yet. When you have those elite freshman talent or that elite freshman talent in store, it can carry you through the regular season, but can it win in March? And it hasn't for Duke in years past, especially recently, I should say. So it's worth noting with this Arkansas team. And a couple other notes that I want to hit on before we get to our national title futures bets from this crop is UCLA. You lose Johnny Juzang, and for a UCLA team that, yes, you still have shooting with Singleton and Clark, but you're also lacking a ton of depth in the front court. You have a 5-star bring that you're bringing in Bona, but you're missing a lot of your interior pieces from last season. No Cody Riley, no Miles Johnson, even though he didn't really produce at the level that I think Mick Cronin wanted. So I'm not super high on UCLA, especially from a price standpoint, Scott. And then Tennessee, I like, but you don't have that go-to scoring option. I think they'll be an elite defensive team. But you think about, again, similar to North Carolina team I mentioned that allowed a ton of open threes. Tennessee similarly did the same thing last year. So an elite defense that can get exposed a little bit more than the numbers allude to on the block. We saw Dickinson do that in the Sweet 16 and, again, giving up their fair share of open threes. Two teams that I like in a sense in UCLA, who is Jaime Jaquez coming back, a potential National Player of the Year candidate, Wooden Award winner in theory, and Tennessee, who brings in Julian Phillips and Tyreke Keith, who I think will make a difference off the bench. But in terms of the number, I don't really love it for the reasons I mentioned.
Yeah, Tennessee's intriguing because obviously they've got that notable win over Gonzaga. And again, you talk about exhibition, but 17 points is going to get people riled up and it's going to get people noticing you. And you talk about some of their pieces returning, Santiago Vescovi and Josiah Jordan-James. Those guys have been through a ton of SEC battles. Like, they're going to be among the most experienced duos returning in the conference. But again, there's a lot of buzz around them. I don't necessarily know if I buy into it. KenPom has them 4th preseason, which is interesting to me, much higher than the books are really placing them. So if you really are a disciple of KenPom and believe in what he is putting forth, then Tennessee's very undervalued. But, again, I think there are major question marks with this team. You've said this, Rick Barnes in March. I don't think I am as worried about that as maybe you are, but it's something to keep an eye on.
No, I mean, and for those reasons, just being in particular, going back to the Michigan game, like when you have pretty formidable bigs, I mean, that's not necessarily on Barnes himself because the talent is there, but to get exposed like that, I think the interior defense is a little worse than it seems like on paper because of those stalwarts in terms of rim protection. They got exposed in that game, and you give up your fair share of open threes. Those are two key areas that we've seen, or at least in terms of giving up open threes. If you go back to the team that had Grant Williams and who's the name I'm blanking on? Schofield. Okay. Coming back down in 3, 2, and 1. That had Grant Williams and had Admiral Schofield. They got exposed from behind the arc in that Purdue game in the Sweet 16. So just a couple of areas to monitor with a Barnes traditionally, elite defense that has a couple flaws to it year over year. But going back to this crop of teams that I mentioned to you in terms of the next year in the college basketball national title futures market, my first college basketball futures bet in this group, and I mentioned I have one other in Florida that I bet back in April. That was more numbers based. But Texas, which I bet at 35-1, is now as low as 20-1. And you could still get that 30-1 bet down at Caesars. So you lose Courtney Ramey and you lose Andrew Jones. You lose Jace Fabra, some shooters, and I think still replaceable pieces. And you bring in Tyrese Hunter, who's the highlight of the offseason for Chris Beard, probably a product of NIL, I think, along the way.
Yeah.
And Serge Jabari Rice from New Mexico State, Dylan Mitchell, the 5-star, and Arterio Morris, an elite recruit as well. So defensively under Chris Beard, you think about the no-middle defense that, again, seemingly the elite Big 12 teams run and operate. Texas led up the 4th lowest shot quality, points per possession in the half court last season. Now you add another healthy rim protector. Now Dylan Dessou was not healthy when he transferred over from Vanderbilt, still recovering from the knee surgery and wasn't healthy overall last season in the latter part of conference and NCAA tournament play when they made that run and nearly upset Purdue in the round of 32. So you now have two undersized rim protectors, but still rim protectors nonetheless. And that's kind of what Beard's no-middle defense hinges on. If you go back to the Texas Tech team that had Tariq Owens and had Noran Sodiase, you had two traditional rim protectors. And Texas's defense was already elite in the half court last season. And then you get an athletic wing in Dylan Mitchell who can switch and guard any position. You add an elite on-ball defender who played in a no-middle defense going back to his one season at Tyrese Hunter, who also ranked in the 99th percentile. This was not absurd in terms of point guard play, I guess, because if you're an elite point guard, you might as well rank in these departments, but it still shows you how good Tyrese Hunter is. Ranked in the 99th percentile in terms of steal rate and the 98th percentile in terms of passing efficiency, which now sets up Marcus Carr to play not just off ball because he'll still have the ball in his hands, but in terms of allowing Carr to focus on his scoring a lot more. The one area I have concern about with Texas, or I am concerned about, is three-point shooting. Besides Serge Rice, a 1.118 points per possession for Jabari Rice on catch and shoot looks. That's from Synergy. So besides his shooting, can you rely on your other guys to produce if Hunter isn't refined offensively in terms of his jump shot? Had the one good game against UCLA in the tournament, and then unless Timmy Allen adds something from three. So that's the one area of concern, but I think the other areas where Texas can be so dominant in kind of mitigate that. And I really like the number that I got, and you could still get that 30-1 over at Caesars.
Yeah, I mean, this team underperformed last year. There's no other way to cut it. There was a ton of hype entering Chris Beard's first season in Austin. He brought in all of those top guys from the portal and really had the icing on the cake by getting Marcus Carr. And then a lot of those guys individually just didn't live up to the expectations, whether it's because of injuries like Dylan Daisu or just not adapting to the Big 12 and to maybe Chris Beard's philosophical defensive philosophy, than you would have thought. But I think another year of these guys gelling together, another year of health, adding Tyrese Hunter, who was incredible in the NCAA tournament. I mean, he became an NBA prospect with the way that he was elevating his shooting compared to what the numbers suggested during the year. But, you love the fact that they have two guards that could, take over and are capable of handling the ball with Carr and Hunter. They've got a lot of, unsung guys like Brock Cunningham, who are veterans who can come in and play a role off the bench. And, there's some real talent with Dylan Mitchell and Arterio Morris that could come in and also produce as well. So, the talent is in place to make another run. I think people are just a little bit skittish based on the underperforming nature of last season, and that's why you're getting some of these numbers right now. But if you believe in Chris Beard, if you believe in the talent level of this team, 30 at that number is very good right now for the talent level this roster has.
No, I mean, you mentioned going back to last season too, and first of all, we've seen it with coaches, and granted, I'm back in one with my second futures bet, again, a much bigger number, but it takes about a year for a coach to truly implement his system, especially a defensive system that relies on rim protection, or at least sound bigs to defend the rim and defend the low post. And with one of them not being healthy for much of last season and then coming back and still not being 100% into Sue, it creates a bit of an issue in terms of the structure that Beard runs at that end of the floor. And then in terms of the backcourt, man, like you mentioned, we harped on this with North Carolina with having an elite backcourt and arguably the best starting duo in Caleb Love and RJ Davis. You can make the case that Texas has the best collective group of lead guards in terms of Hunter, Marcus Carr, and Arterio Morris, if Morris is as good as advertised, which he was in their scrimmage against Arkansas. Again, it's a scrimmage, but he looked the part against a very high-level freshman-laden team in the Arkansas Razorbacks.
Yeah, absolutely. The talent is here. Nobody's questioning that. It's just whether a lot of these guys finally live up to the expectations that were in place last season. I think they're capable of that. I like the number at 30. Again, I think Chris Beard, he's shown what he's capable of, and he's usually able to put together rosters on the fly that are successful. Now that he has guys that are returning and that have had a year under their belt with him, I think that they have a very high upside.
No question. So now, Scott, without further ado, you have a futures bet that is in this 6-team tier, and I don't necessarily agree with it. You like my Texas bet. I like the team. I don't love the number considering where they opened at, but without further ado, what is your first national title futures bet?
I'm intrigued by Creighton, and I wish I would have gotten the number, obviously, after the second round loss to Kansas in the NCAA tournament last year, where they were missing so many key pieces, but still gave the Jayhawks one of the more memorable games of the tournament in terms of just, what's happening here type of games. But yeah, the thing that really stands out to me about Creighton is that last year they got it done defensively, and a great offensive coach in Greg McDermott really didn't have a very good offense. And, he's the type of coach that can get, open looks from multiple guys at a moment's notice. And guys just didn't deliver last year. But, I think now that they're healthy, now that they have two guys that can lead them in terms of primary ball handling, having Ryan Nembhard back, Trey Alexander really elevated his play once Nembhard went down in February and really looked the part in the Big East tournament, the NCAA tournament. And, adding Baylor Shireman, again, maybe not a household name for college basketball fans, but the reigning Summit Player of the Year, who really should do quite a bit for that offense. He can knock down shots. He spaces the floor at 46%. He's an elevated passer who is very, very good at moving the ball without having to think about things. And I think having a capable veteran guy on the wing like him, coupled with what they have in the backcourt, coupled with Ryan Kalkbrenner's defense on the interior and Arthur Kaluma and his athleticism and the leap that he could take this year, I'm fascinated by this team. They add a transfer in Francisco Farabello, who's TCU's best shooter last season. You look at Mason Miller, who's the son of Mike Miller. I mean, you think about some of the best shooters that the game has seen over the last 20 years, and Mike Miller is near that top of that list. And, having his son in the equation, who is a better athlete than people give him credit for, is just another rotation piece. And, you're looking at Creighton in some cases at a number near 30. I like what I see here. I think that their offense does improve this season. They have one of the better offensive-minded coaches in the country. And, you have that reliable piece down low in Kalkbrenner, who not only defends the rim and gets things done down there, but does so without fouling. I think he only reached 4 fouls one time last year, didn't foul out once. And, you look at the type of bigs that he has to face in the Big East with UConn and some of these other teams, and he's got a chance to really make an impact down there just by himself. And this team really fascinates me if that offense gets clicking like they have in past years in Omaha.
No, it's a great point. It's not your typical Creighton team like you mentioned in terms of a potentially elite defense with Kalkbrenner leading the way. But a couple issues with the Blue Jays for me, and you mentioned Shireman. We didn't see it a ton because he didn't face the competition that he faced in the one game in the tournament. I know it's a one-game sample size, so you could take whatever out of it that you want in theory, but played Providence, a team in the Big East, so it has that connection in terms of going to Creighton now in his first season at a high major program. He didn't look the part in the half court in terms of being able to handle that physicality. Great downhill player for McDermott's high-tempo offense. I'm not disagreeing, up-tempo offense. I'm not disagreeing with any of what you said in terms of what he could bring to this team offensively. And maybe he doesn't necessarily need to be a half-court player in that sense in terms of attacking off the dribble if he's spacing the floor like he can. The question is when he does attempt to do what he is capable of and was capable in the Summit League, attacking off the bounce, he's going up against a much more physical conference. It's not the Villanova that what we've seen and what we're accustomed to in terms of years past, but still an elite at high level conference, maybe not elite conference, but a Power 5 conference in terms of the context of college basketball. So I'm a little concerned about Shireman making that jump and maybe the overhype there from that perspective. And the one other concern I have with Creighton is turnovers, the bottom 60 turnover rate last year.
That's fair.
So two concerns. It's also the number going from 90-ish now to 30. Obviously, we're working with what we're playing with. So you want to take a shot on Creighton 30-1. They're bringing everything back. Or pretty much everything back. I totally understand it from that standpoint. Those are just the two concerns that I have with the Blue Jays.
Yeah, for me, Baylor Shireman doesn't need to be anywhere close to a go-to guy like he needed to be against Providence in that NCAA tournament game. So I think that mitigates some of the concern there. But, I think he can play a Mitchell Ballack type of role in this offense, especially with his passing, which I think is very underrated. And, if they're able to get him open looks, which Greg McDermott does as well as any coach in the country, I think he's going to thrive. He's going to have the green light from anywhere probably to 30 feet. And, he's the type of player that doesn't really need to be a go-to guy in any sense of the word. He just has to fit his role in a team that was already very sound. So, he just adds that perimeter shooting that they needed along with Farabello, and you hopefully get a leap from Nembhard and Alexander in terms of maybe, toning down some of the turnovers and the wildness they had in their freshman seasons. And I'm very interested in the ceiling of this team.
It's similar to a ceiling of a TCU just in terms of when you compare turnover issues from last year. If they're able to tame some of those problems offensively, you bring in a guy like Wells who wasn't healthy last year for the Horned Frogs. So just of note there, a bigger number in the TCU Horned Frogs, and I mentioned already a couple teams I like, and not one that I bet in Baylor, but Texas that I'm very high on and is one of my national title futures bets. But Scott, as we kind of continue along here on the odds board, I want to touch on my other national title bet that I made in April, and then we can get to another team that you're high on out of the ACC, maybe a team that you haven't pulled the trigger on, but a team that you're kind of like in terms of the makeup and being a threat in that conference. So a long shot that I bet going back to April, when I think it was the night that Scotty Scheffler actually won the Masters. Scott, I don't know if you had won any money on Scheffler winning that tournament.
I had Cam Smith 50-1, so that was a heartbreaking day for me.
Apologies there for bringing up that memory.
It happens. I mean, it is what it is. But yeah, Florida at the number you got is a fascinating team this season. I'll let you go more into them, but the return of Colin Castleton was the key for everything.
No question, yeah. So I made the bet before Castleton came back. Then he comes back, and I think the number went down to around 190-1, depending on where you're shopping. So you bring in Todd Golden, who was a massive coaching upgrade from Mike White, who I thought was actually making strides, Scott, watching that Florida offense at the beginning of last season because they were running more 5-out to suit Castleton's game. Because I think at this point, in terms of year over year, he's going to be a better perimeter shooter than he was last year, and that also has to do with how Golden develops his bigs. If you go back to Masalski last season at San Francisco with Dons, but I was still kind of surprised that then all of a sudden he shifted back to kind of operating Castleton solely through the low post. So I kind of hate Mike White is essentially what I'm trying to say. And you have, again, a huge upgrade going from White to Golden. And then you bring in Kyle Lofton, who actually rated higher in terms of steal rate and passing efficiency in terms of both of those percentiles, higher than Tyrese Hunter. And I know he's coming from a mid-major program, so a little different context when you look at some of those metrics, but still worth noting. Then you bring in a high ceiling 4 in Alex Fudge from LSU, a very good wing defender who hopefully develops his game offensively in Will Richard, Trey Bonham from VMI who could back up Lofton, and a very high ceiling offensive player in terms of the way Todd Golden wants to operate his offense, get efficient three-point shots and shots around the rim. This offense is going to be designed heavily around analytics, which you have to like in terms of guys coming together and actually making that jump in year one. Like we touched on with Texas, it doesn't necessarily always happen that quickly. So you have all the pieces coming in. You have defensive length. They didn't necessarily get the big that I would have liked alongside Castleton, like guys like Osunahi from St. Bonaventure, another St. Bonaventure transfer, Broom that ended up going from Morehead State to Auburn. So I wish they added that one extra piece, and that's why I don't necessarily love the 60 to 80-1 range. I wouldn't jump on it right now. It might take time for them to develop over the course of the season, but still a team I'm high on in the long term in terms of making a run in March.
Yeah, I like Todd Golden a lot. Excuse me, we got tongue-tied there a little bit. You know, the analytics thing is something to note. He plays the 2-for-1s. He plays advantages. He's going to have unique lineups and situational awareness that other coaches might not necessarily have. But, you know, I also think that this roster might be a year away. I mean, they had to rebuild on the fly. They had to get new pieces in. Getting Castleton back was key, but I just have concerns that when Colin Castleton's your best player and in a year of so many great big guys, he's not even maybe in the top 5. You could debate that, but I just wonder if this team really has the star power to match the ceiling of some of these other teams we've talked about. And, you know, a lot of that's going to come with Golden getting this first-year roster together. There's been some positive buzz around a lot of guys on campus. Riley Kugel is one of the highest-rated, in-state recruits that they brought in. And, you know, Jonathan Gavoini's already kind of touting him on Twitter after seeing a practice. So there is a lot to like here, especially at the number you got them at. But Again, this is Todd Golden's first time coaching high major basketball. The SEC has been very difficult top to bottom in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of great coaches in that league, so that's an adjustment for him as well. A lot of these coaches and programs we've talked about before this are, traditional guys that have been in place for many years. Golden is kind of an outlier in that he's coming up from the mid-major ranks, and this is his first year in the spotlight in the SEC. So, again, I think he's going to be a heck of a coach. It's a great hire in a lot of senses, but there are question marks as to how this roster acclimates, how Todd Golden acclimates, and how this team just looks overall.
No, 100%. It's baked into the number, especially a massive number I got.
Of course,
quickly can you, right, how quickly can you develop chemistry and camaraderie in year one, not only from a coaching level, but from a personnel standpoint. And to give Golden a little more credit, he was an assistant under Bruce Pearl on that Final Four team. So he does have he does have the history of coaching a high major program, but you make the jump can you make the jump in year one from an elite assistant? He was the guy that brought in Harper at Auburn, mind you, to now a head coach with star power, maybe not the star power that you would like in terms of a bet to win a national title, but at that number, that was my thinking going into it. So fair points Absolutely. By you for sure. Now we go from Scott, an inexperienced head coach, to a very experienced head coach, another team that I know you want to touch on from the ACC.
Yeah, I think Virginia's a little bit underrated here, Eli, especially when you potentially look at an ACC conference bet with just how Tony Bennett has a mastery of that conference and an ability to win there. But, this isn't going to be the sexiest team to watch. We know that. They're going to play slow. They're going to grind it out. But, I think a lot of the pitfalls that they underwent last season, they have a chance to really shake things up in the ACC this year. Kihei Clark is one of the most veteran point guards returning in college hoops. I think Armand Franklin's three-point percentage should ideally go back up from a sub 30%. And, Caden Shedrick, someone we've talked about off pod, I think is only going to get better and better as he continues to add weight. So, this is an interesting team for me. You're kind of banking on Tony Bennett here. I don't necessarily love them as a national title contender at the number that they're currently at, which I think I saw 60 in some places. I'm trying to find it here offhand real quick, but I don't
40.
Love them.
There's a 40, a 50, even a 60 out there, depending on where you're
looking.
There's
there's a couple 60s at places like Caesar. So, that's an okay number. I don't necessarily view them as a national title contender at this point, but what I do like is the 7-1 ACC number that places like Rivers have. I think that North Carolina's aspirations are on bigger things than the ACC. There's no question that they are the best team in the ACC and they have the most talent. Duke is going to do some interesting things in terms of their freshman class and John Shire's first year, but I think Virginia, there's a lot to be said for them kind of sneaking up on some people and creeping at a decent number, particularly to win the ACC.
No, I think we have our first show bet here on Outside Shots, which is Virginia to win the conference at 7-1. I'm with you, Scott. I'm very high on the Hoos. I have them rated 12th in my lines.com college basketball power ratings. And you mentioned offensively with Franklin kind of reasserting himself as a three-point shooter, going back to his Indiana, 2 seasons there with the Hoosiers, go from the Hoosiers to the Hoos. But it's kind of similar to me with my Florida thinking. I didn't necessarily mention this name, but Myron Jones underperformed. And I guess you could say you would expect that under Mike White going from how he shot at Penn State. Now, then it took a massive downturn at Florida in his first year. I think that 3-point percentage is going to spike back up. So similar to what you're talking about with Virginia's 3-point shooting, seeing some positive regression, you get Vander Plas from Ohio, which adds to that perimeter floor space. And you mentioned Clark, the rim protection with Shedrick and Cafaro. It's questionable in terms of the half court because when Gardner that mid-range shot isn't going down, then things kind of start to get sporadic, especially when the floor spacing isn't there, which it wasn't consistently, at least with a guy like Franklin. But I think Vander Plas starts to refine those numbers along with Franklin going back to what he typically shoots at from 3. So I'm with you, Scott. I think in terms of the context of the ACC, we've already touched on what we don't like about North Carolina. And then a team like Duke that brought in some veteran pieces off the bench, and you still have a veteran point guard that came around in the tournament and really probably became arguably their second best player and their second most important player in the NCAA tournament going to the Final Four. But from a shooting standpoint and just from a freshman expectation standpoint, how much can you expect from Lively and Whitehead when they're dealing with their own injuries at a time where you really need to develop in this early portion of non-conference play?
Yeah, Duke is easily the most fascinating team in the country to me. Obviously, replacing Coach K is going to be a monster storyline in and of itself. But then you look at John Shire with the just ridiculous freshman class that he has coming in. And, on paper, the talent level's there. But it's just going to be kind of a complete mystery in terms of what we see from this team and how they actually decide to play until they actually roll the ball out there. Because you look at John Shire as a head coach, he's replacing the biggest shoes in the game, in the history of the game. And again, I don't love that Whitehead's hurt right now. I think they're going to have an incredible front court with Lively and Filipowski and how those two can complement each other. But again, with the question marks there, I think that you look at some of these secondary teams like Virginia, who only does have to play Duke once in the ACC schedule, and that's an interesting 7-1 number for me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm on, I think that's our show bet here. Virginia to win the ACC conference at 7-1 for better or worse. And you can check out more analysis on that over at thelines.com. But Scott, to wrap up this podcast and just to cap it here for people who are either skimming through, we hope you do listen to this entire preseason, or I guess semi-preseason lengthy podcast as we break down the top teams and the futures that we find most intriguing. But just to recap it, I have a futures bet on Texas at 35-1. Best price you can find in the market is 30-1 over at Caesars. And Scott is taking Creighton at 30-1 to win the national title as well. And we also have a show bet on Virginia to win the ACC at 7-1. So 3 bets that I like overall. We're not going to try to overdo it here. I think people that have a massive futures portfolio, unless you're taking a bunch of long shots, is a little much. Like someone I saw on Twitter had like 4, 16, 20-1 bets. And, that's a little rich in terms of this early in the season and investing a unit or so in some of these teams where there are a lot of question marks in the early portion of the odds board. And I mentioned Florida too, that I have a long shot, but wouldn't necessarily bet at the current number, especially because they didn't get the last piece as a big man that I wanted. But Scott, let's take a look here at some of the early games. In the first week, that is a very small slate, and I'll kind of run through some spots that I'm looking at here. The first bet that I have in Discord that you can go check out, go subscribe to thelines.com Discord channel, get notifications on when Scott and I, again, make single game bets and futures bets throughout the college basketball season. I bet Oral Roberts on Friday, so yesterday as we're recording this on Saturday evening here. Bet Oral Roberts at plus 10.5 against St. Mary's. That number is down to 9 or 10-1. I think the Gales are, or not 9 or 10-1, plus 9, plus 9.5, maybe a plus 10 you might be able to find. St. Mary's, you lose 2 huge pieces for their ball screen offense in terms of Matisse Toss and Tommy Kuzi. So I think St. Mary's is a little bit overvalued from that standpoint. And you also think about a St. Mary's defense that forces opponents to run a lot of isolation scoring sets. And you think about how they run teams out the three-point line as well. And those are a little bit concerning factors going into this game, but they are susceptible in terms of off-the-dribble three-point shooting. You think about Oral Roberts bringing back their top three three-point shooters going back to last season, including Max A. Smith. So I think Oral Roberts is able to keep this thing within 3 possessions, even, obviously a little over that if you grab the 10.5. So you can check out that write-up over at thelines.com. It should be up as this podcast goes up on Monday morning. Scott, any intrigue for you in a team like Oral Roberts that when you think about not only do they have their best three-point shooters back, but they also brought in a couple key bigs, transfers in Connor Vanover and Patrick Mwaba from UT Arlington, who I really like as a mid-major 4-5.
First, can I just say how incredible it is that we get to see Max Abmas stay? I mean, like in an era of up transfers and NIL and guys just going to the highest bidder or the highest league, to see him stay put and now have a really fun mid-major team around him is just going to be a ton of fun to watch this year. And, looking over this roster, there's so many guys now that are able to complement his explosive scoring ability. And, you touched on McBride and Mwaba and some of these other guys. And we were talking a little bit about Connor Vanover off pod, and, obviously not the player that many envisioned him being as a potential, 4-star top 100-ish recruit who was recruited in state to Arkansas. But, at 7'5", you just don't see that type of size every single night, especially at the mid-major level and especially on an opening night of the season. So I do like your play here. I think if Abmas has a big game and starts to get loose, that they could potentially even pull off an outright. But, to me, getting that 10.5 is key, and I think that this is going to be an interesting opening night game compared to the awful slate of games that we generally have.
I'm with you. I think Oral Roberts is live here too. I did sprinkle a little bit on the money line, not my my overall bet. My overall bet is Niner plus 9, plus 9.5, plus 10. I grabbed the plus 10.5. I would bet this thing down to plus 9 if that's the only number you can get. But I think Oral Roberts is going to make this game very competitive, especially the only concern, and I mentioned also again, the isolation scoring, forcing teams to score in those ISO sets, which Randy Bennett does as well as any major coach, and probably at a top 10 rate among the high major coaches across college basketball. But Logan Johnson is also an elite isolation defender. So him going up against Asmus, who's a very high-level scorer, that's a little concerning. And we saw Johnson slow down Jamari Bouye going back to some of those St. Mary's and San Francisco matchups last season. But one other game that I want to touch on here, because it's the most notable game on the card this week, Scott, is Michigan State Gonzaga. If we look ahead to Friday, and I'll have some write-ups up over some other games that I want to bet on Friday's card, but probably not a game I'm interested in betting, but just because you have two notable teams. My issue with Michigan State, even though they're probably going to get around 3 possessions, maybe this thing climbs up to 9.5 or 10 with Gonzaga laying a little over 3 possessions. Michigan State's going to struggle to rebound after what they lost in the front court. And you can make the case that Marcus Bingham was out of position at times, but he's still a body and a rebounding presence for them going back to last season. And especially if Joey Hauser is your 5-man, you are going to struggle a lot defensively. So while I'm kind of higher than on AJ Hoggard than I am the rest of, maybe it seems like, Michigan State doubters, because I think Hoggard's going to take a step up offensively, and that backcourt could be semi-explosive with him and Walker. I just have a lot of concerns with their ability to limit second chance shots, and also just defensively with Joey Hauser going up against Drew Timme. Good luck.
Yeah, there's a lot of skittishness around that program right now, too. The exhibition game was very underwhelming. I think they were losing at the half, if I'm not mistaken. When, you take an exhibition game, it is what it is, but when you're losing to a D2 opponent, it scares your fan base a little bit, justifiably so. But, I just worry about this team's lack of star power. And it's not that Izzo has ever needed stars to be successful. On the contrary, he's one of the best at maximizing what he has. But again, when he has been at his best, he's had All-Americans. He's had Cassius Winston at his disposal. He's had, studs that could really play. And this team just lacks a stud. I mean, there's plenty of steady veteran pieces. When you have guys that have played for 3 or 4 years under Tom Izzo, you expect them to understand the role and know what they're doing. But I mean, where's the double figure scoring coming from? Is it going to be that balanced where they're able to compete with an elite level team like Gonzaga, where Michigan State's going to be able to compete for the Big Ten this season? I have my doubts, but you never doubt Tom Izzo. He gets the most out of his guys when possible. Again, the slow start to the exhibition, just kind of the skittishness around the fans of the program right now. This is going to be kind of a fascinating early test for Michigan State.
No question. And while I was, I had my issues with Gabe Brown's shot selection at times. He was a little shot happy going back to last year when his role expanded, and Max Christie also. Even though I question their shot selection at times, they're still much more high-level scorers than what Michigan State probably has on the roster right now. And then Malik Hall, I think, is going to take a step up for them offensively. But again, still a lot of
he definitely will. Yeah, I think, Malik Hall is going to be a pillar in their front court. He's been there for 4 years. Hauser's been there for 3-4 years after the transfer. These are guys that have played for many years under Tom Izzo. But Jaden Akins needs to make that leap that everyone's talking about.
Got to be healthy.
Potentially making. He's got to be healthy too. But I just don't see the star power here. It really concerns me quite a bit in terms of their ceiling.
I'm with you, Scott. So that's going to do it for us here on the first episode of the Outside Shots podcast. Again, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, that is no longer iTunes. Subscribe, rate, and review. Leave us a 5-star review, and you'll have a chance to win an Amazon gift card. And if you're watching on YouTube, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notifications for whenever a new episode is live. And Scott, this was a lot of fun, man. Follow Scott on Twitter at Phillips Hoops. Follow me on Twitter at Eli Herskovich. Scott, any last words before we sign off?
It's going to be a really fun season, Eli. Like we said, there's not really a juggernaut contender that is kind of a head above the rest. So to see some of these early season tournaments that we're looking forward to during Feast Week, the PK events are obviously unique every 5 years, and that brings a lot of star power together. I think we're really going to start to see things around Thanksgiving week. But, these first couple of weeks will still teach us a lot about some of these teams. And hopefully as the matchups start to pick up, we'll see some good games here.
No question. And that'll do it for our first episode of the Outside Shots podcast. So long, and we'll talk to you next Monday.